Good evening, everyone. I am Mustansar Siam, and I am joined by Dr. Ilhan Niaz, a prominent Pakistani historian and author of 4 books, including Culture of Power and Governance of Pakistan and the State during the British Raj, Imperial Governance in South Asia from 1700 to 1947. Dr. Ilhan Niaz is the chairman of Department of History Quaid, Azam University Islamabad, and today we are here to discuss with Dr. Ilhan Niaz that how East Pakistan got separated and what needs to be learned. Thank you so much, Dr. Ilhan, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, Dr. Ilhan, my first question to you is what actually happened on the eve of 16 December 1971? What remained some proximate factors which ultimately led to the separation of East Pakistan?
Well, I mean, as I also mentioned when you contacted me, that I am not actually an expert on East Pakistan or on the secession of East Pakistan. There are plenty of people better qualified than me to comment on that particular crisis and its outcome. I'm also not a military historian, so I only know about what happened on December 16th based upon memoirs and other things that were made public about that period of time. So what I gather is that what happened was that the Indians were successful in reaching the outskirts of the capital of East Pakistan, and that the will of the Pakistani military commander in East Pakistan to continue offering resistance collapsed, and that triggered the surrender of the military and civil personnel representing the central government in East Pakistan to the Indians. Of course, technically speaking, if you've seen the famous Dawn headline from the next day, it says to the effect that, the war is going to continue, but for all practical purposes, that meant that the war on the Eastern Front was over.
Okay, sir.
As far as the causes are concerned, I mean, there are so many that we can get into. There are so many that we can discuss. I think at one level, you can say that it was in terms of Pakistan's military and political decision-making during the crisis itself. That was extremely faulty. There was a failure to anticipate likely Indian actions. There was also a failure to prepare for a serious military strategy to defend East Pakistan in the event of an Indian attack. This failure partly had its roots in the traditional security doctrine that prevailed at the time about how the defense of the eastern wing of the country lay in the western wing of the country, which justified the concentration of military assets in the Western theater. But as we all know from the 1965 war, those assets concentrated in the Western theater were barely enough to stop an Indian attack across the international border. They obviously were not sufficiently strong to actually create enough a counteroffensive that it would deter the Indians from taking on East Pakistan if they felt that an opportunity had arisen.
Okay, sir. Sir, we had seen that after the separation of East Pakistan, there had been criticism on two-nation theory. Indira Gandhi famously noted that we had drawn two-nation theory in Bay of Bengal. Do you think that the separation of East Pakistan was basically the negation of the very idea of two-nation theory?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that if we go back to the partition of Bengal taken by Curzon, at that time, when East Bengal was separated from West Bengal and created as a Muslim majority province, the Hindus of West Bengal were extremely upset by that. And that led to a very serious agitation. And ultimately, it led to an undoing of that partition. But then what we see is that in the 1940s, as you have the rise of Muslim nationalism, when the time came to actually go for independence the Hindus of West Bengal were not willing to live in a united Bengal state where the majority of the population would happen to be Muslim. So, in a way, that episode itself basically demonstrates that the bond between the Hindu Bengalis and the Muslim Bengalis, even though they shared so much else in common in terms of culture, language, and other things, was somehow trumped by the fact that the Hindu Bengalis were not willing to live in a state where the majority would be held by Muslim Bengalis. Now, regarding the overall structure of Pakistan in terms of how it comes into existence in 1947, over there, there is little doubt that when you compare East Pakistan or East Bengal, as it was then called, to the territories that were to become the western wing of the country, there really wasn't much other than religious commonality that gave the state of Pakistan a sense of national togetherness or national identification. So, in that sense, what we can also say is that between 1947 and 1971, the leaders of Pakistan, which were predominantly, of course, from the western wing of the country, were unable to actually provide the kind of content, the kind of political programs, the kind of social uplift that would have convinced the people of East Pakistan that they were better off remaining part of a united Muslim state. So I think that, when it comes to nationalism or when it comes to any form of ideology, these debates are always highly subjective in a sense that the same people who were very keen on Pakistan in 1947, if you look at the Muslim League in Bengal, it was in many ways a better developed political party in East Bengal than it was in the western parts of what would become Pakistan. But after independence, the East Bengalis seem to have lost the confidence that they would have a fair chance of participating in the politics and in the decision making of a united Pakistan. But of course, I mean, from Indira Gandhi's perspective, certainly, I think that she would have felt validated in the sense of having drowned the two-nation theory, as she put it. But on the other hand, if the two-nation theory was really incorrect, then certainly the Hindu Bengalis may have preferred to have had a united Bengali state rather than separating and being a part of India. So you can make an argument either ways.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you. Sir, there is another very relevant and predominant argument about the separation of East Pakistan, that Pakistan actually born with a geographical defect because the distance between East Pakistan and West Pakistan was 1600 kilometers. And it is stated that it was something, and this edifice, political edifice, eventually would have to be separated. How would you see this argument, which is based on geography?
Well, I would basically say that in today's world, when you have modern means of communication, formal geographical distance is not by itself an indicator that a territory or a group of territories cannot work together as part of a united government. So, for example, if you look at the American Federation, Alaska and Hawaii are located very far from the continental United States. And you could make an argument that that distance means that they should not be a part of the United States. In a similar manner, there are other states like, let's say Indonesia, that have a large amount of islands that are separated from each other, where internal communications are, in the traditional sense, quite challenging. but they have been able to maintain their coherence as nation states or states post 1945. So I think that certainly geographic distance can pose challenges, but geographic distance in and of itself does not seem to be the determining factor in whether a state or a federation can work together for a long period of time.
Exactly, sir. This is very interesting. Sir, let's suppose if the powers were handed over to the Awami League or Sheikh Mujib, would the debacle of East Pakistan still had happened?
Well, actually, I think that the 1970 elections uh, actually returned a verdict which would have led to a fundamental change in the structure of Pakistan as a state, because the Awami League, notwithstanding any other promises that it might have made, was committed to the implementation of the 6 points program. And that program taken together, while it would not have led to the secession of East Pakistan, it would have practically turned Pakistan into a loose confederation with essentially two practically sovereign wings. So that type of a solution is something which was not acceptable to the elites of West Pakistan. And in that context, when the Awami League won by such a resounding majority in the 1970 elections, that then also created pressure on the Awami League, since it now commanded a simple majority in the overall National Assembly that was to be convened. And since Yahya Khan had actually made it possible for constitutional provisions to be carried by a simple majority, the expectation for the Awami League was quite clear that they had a simple majority, and as and when the Constituent Assembly would be convened, they would be able to essentially vote whatever type of constitution they wanted to, and the remaining votes would have been insufficient to stop them. So in that sense, I would say that even if the Awami League had been allowed to form the government, as was their right on the basis of the election results, they would have gone ahead with the implementation of the 6-point program in a best case scenario. And that 6-point program would have practically dismantled Pakistan as a federation and turned it into a very loose confederation.
Okay, sir. Sir, do you think that constitutional confusion, as you have mentioned, constitutional confusion remained another reason behind this strategy, behind this uh, issue, because the political forces remained failed to bring a constitution according to the true spirit of federation. Several attempts had been taken by political forces, but they had repeatedly been failed. We can see basic principle report 1, 2, 3, 1 unit, and other so many things which had happened, but actually they could not make a constitution according to the true spirit of federation.
Well, I think the failure of our first Constituent Assembly to actually formulate a constitution within a reasonable amount of time is quite possibly the great political failure, the great failure of our political class, if you will, that effectively enabled the bureaucracy and the military to increase their intervention in politics and then start various types of experiments, including 1 unit, including interwing parity, including bringing prime ministers in and chucking them out whenever they prove to be inconvenient for them, and ultimately, of course, leading to an overt military intervention in politics in the form of the October 1958 coups. So I think in our context, yes, the failure of the first Constituent Assembly to actually deliver a constitution within a reasonable amount of time, say 4 to 5 years, actually then sets Pakistan up for what is basically a permanent constitutional crisis. And we have never been able to quite come out of that constitutional crisis. I mean, even today, you have people talking about doing away with the current constitution or amending it to turn it into a presidential system and that sort of stuff. So I think you must, the Muslim League leaders, 1947 to 1951 or so, they were in charge of the country. They were definitely making all of the important decisions. We had civilian supremacy. We had a civilian political leadership that had considerable legitimacy and considerable authority. And regrettably, they were unable to do essentially the one big job that they had to do, which
Exactly.
was to formulate a constitution for the country.
Very
And
true.
once that first constituent assembly was overthrown, then subsequent efforts carried with them that stigma of extra constitutional, extra legal intervention in the political process.
Okay, sir. Sir, let me talk about today's Pakistan, what we can learn from this unfortunate incident, because there are still reservations coming from, particularly from South Punjab and Balochistan.
Well, I actually am of the view that Pakistan, that is to say, the western part of Pakistan, if you think of pre 71, and obviously then all of Pakistan after 71, actually has a fair bit going for it in terms of national integration and in terms of the ability, if we want to make a case that these territories have enough of a commonality by way of geography, by way of a shared river system, a shared pattern of agricultural economy, by virtue of the fact that there has been a tremendous amount of internal migration over the last 50, 60 years that has led to a situation where many different communities are now living alongside each other in our major cities, whatever their origins might be. I think that we can actually make a pretty good case that Pakistan is in the process of acquiring the characteristics of a national state. But what I find more interesting is that our elites, they continue to beat the drum of religion as the primary instrument of identifying Pakistanis as a national state. Now, before 1971, that made sense because, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there really wasn't much else other than religion that bound East Pakistan and West Pakistan together. But after 1971, there is actually a great deal of other things that bind the people of West Pakistan pre-71, people of Pakistan post-71 together. And instead of actually trying to cultivate a sense of national identity rooted in the shared historical experience of the Indus region, rooted in the tremendous amount of demographic change and interaction that has taken place over the last several generations, we still seem to be sort of imagining that, it is the year 1946 and we want to bring all of the Muslims together on essentially a communal or a religious platform. So in a way, I fear that Pakistan has sort of become trapped by the original programming of the Pakistan movement, that we have not been able to grow beyond our original programming. And notwithstanding the fact that the objective situation now would actually allow for a more balanced, a more historical, a more geographical sense of Pakistani nationalism to be promoted, we're still stuck in the whole Islam is in danger and you're a Muslim first, and it is because you are a Muslim that you are a Pakistani. So there appears to be a disconnect that our leaders and our elites and our cultural propagandists for the state, they seem to be existing in this sort of a time warp where, we are still under British rule and we have to bring all the Muslims together, and Islam is the force that can provide that asfiya.
Okay, sir. Dr. Saab, let me include some questions from young Pakistani students. Ghulam Jasagir Dahar from Khairpur, Sindh asks, has Pakistan learned the lesson from the fall of Dhaka, particularly when there is greater demand by the state to reverse the 18th Amendment?
Well, it depends upon what lessons we are talking about. So, for example, one big lesson that Pakistan learned from the secession of East Pakistan is that all this rhetoric about there being a rules-based international order, all this rhetoric about there being an architecture of alliances that will protect smaller states against stronger states, that all of that was in fact complete nonsense. That essentially, if you are a second tier power operating in the world and you want to retain a certain amount of autonomy in your decision making, then the only way you can do that is by relying upon your own defensive capabilities. So in that context, I think that Pakistani elites did draw a very powerful lesson from the secession of East Pakistan. And they decided to embark upon a very ambitious for that time project of making Pakistan a nuclear weapons state. So that is one lesson that they definitely did draw. And if anyone has been, watching what is happening to the Ukraine, I mean, Pakistanis can certainly sympathize with what the Ukrainians are experiencing it, because we experienced something very similar in 1971, when a more powerful neighbor essentially tried to, and succeeded in that case, bringing
Exactly.
about a change to UN recognized boundaries through the use of military force. But Pakistanis also fully understand, as the Ukrainian president is now realizing, that you're essentially on your own. No one's going to come to help you. And I think that realization and the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear power has a lot to do with the secession of East Pakistan. Of course, there are other lessons as well that we should have learned from that. So one lesson, for example, that we should have learned from the crisis in East Pakistan and what happened during it is that our governments need to treat our people a lot better than they actually do. That if you disrespect people, if you humiliate people, if you cause unnecessary harm to people, and those people think that you are doing those things to them because they happen to belong to underprivileged or marginalized communities, then obviously that will breed alienation, it will breed discontent, it will create continuous problems for you in the peripheries. It will also be damaging for your international reputation. So unfortunately, post 1971, Pakistan seems to have become a more communally oriented state. So the kind of oppression that Pakistan visits on religious minorities, that's there for all to see, the way in which the Pakistani government treats dissidents. I mean, these days there is a whole thing going on about the whole PICA Revision Act. Of course, PICA was originally passed by the PMLN government, and that under the current government, they're trying to make it even more draconian in order to go after anybody who might disagree or might dissent from the policies or the personalities of the government. So I am again afraid that that lesson we seem to have not learned from the East Pakistan crisis.
Okay, sir. Sir, Nirmal Munir from Department of History and Pakistan Studies, University of the Punjab, asks that do you believe one unit was a blunder introduced to create artificial parity between the eastern and western wings?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that one unit is a good example of what happens when bureaucrats and military officers apply their essentially linear sequential way of thinking to trying to resolve what are incredibly complicated political problems. So if you read, for example, the 1960 report on West Pakistan, Provincial Administration report, the civil servants charged with that report are extremely confident that, one unit, once they have created one unit in West Pakistan, they are confident that simply creating an administrative unit will, in the passage of time, automatically manufacture loyalty to that one unit. Then when it comes to interwing parity, this is actually something that could have been managed without one unit. So, I mean, you didn't necessarily have to have one unit. You could have always redistributed representation between the eastern wing of the country and the western wing of the country, without doing away with the different territories and states that comprised West Pakistan. But again, when it comes to the thinking of that period, there was this idea that if we have a single big province in West Pakistan and another single big province in the form of East Pakistan, that will somehow create a balanced federal structure. And of course, it did not create a balanced federal structure. West Pakistan itself was not a very stable unit. The smaller provinces and territories of what became West Pakistan's one unit province were not happy with the arrangement of being governed entirely by Lahore. And of course, at the end of the day, it actually created more potential for interwing rivalry and alienated East Pakistan as well. So, on the whole, whatever the intention might have been, the results weren't very sanguine for Pakistan.
Exactly, sir. Sir, Saqib Hussain from Department of Political Science, Government College, University Lahore asks that, how would you analyze the role of extra-parliamentary forces in this debacle?
Well, I would say that beginning with the overthrow of Khwaja Nazimuddin in 1953, continuing to essentially the advent of the first People's Party government in the aftermath of the secession of East Pakistan, Pakistan was under the rule of the bureaucracy and the military. Between 1953 and 1958, they experimented with a kind of hybrid setup that ultimately did not work. So between 58 and 71, it was a military dictatorship. So I think that the responsibility for the East Pakistan debacle rests primarily with those who were making the decisions between 1953 and 1970-71. And those people who were making decisions during this period of time were almost entirely senior civil servants and military officers. So since they had the power, they must also bear the responsibility.
Okay, sir. Sir, my last question to you is not directly linked with our today's debate. It is about your recently published book, The State During the British Raj, Imperial Governance in South Asia from 1700 to 1947. You have argued that the Pakistani and Indian elites remained unsuccessful in modernizing institutional frameworks. Can you please explain how and in what ways the failure of the institutional frameworks resulted in the crisis of governance in South Asia?
Right. I think if we, let's say, look at just Pakistan, our own experience, the British Indian civil service structure, just to take one example, was not organized, nor was it intended to bring about rapid economic development or industrialization or any of the things that the government of Pakistan wanted to bring about after 1947. What happens in Pakistan is that rather than reforming our civil service structure in order to keep those aspects of the imperial legacy that are useful, i.e. having a merit-based civil service, and modifying those things that are not useful or that are harmful, such as the overemphasis on having generalists, non-specialists in all key decision-making positions. What we do is that we blindly adhere to the myth of the general administrator as the proper person to be heading highly specialized departments. Now, in 1959, Ayub Khan created the Pay and Services Commission. It was chaired by Justice Cornelius. Cornelius himself, of course, was a former ICS officer, and he then went into the judiciary. And he's, of course, very famous as a judge because of his refusal to agree with the doctrine of necessity. But in his capacity as the chairman of this Pay and Services Commission, he essentially made the case that if Pakistan would like to modernize, it needs a civil service structure that is knowledge-based, subject-based, and highly specialized. So what he proposed was that every subject, every government department should essentially operate in a self-contained hierarchy with integration between its secretariat and its field postings. What he was arguing for was that what we should do is that, if you want to, let's say, have health, or you want to have education, or you want to build infrastructure, you essentially need specialized services for these things. And in those specialized services, you need to recruit people with specialized knowledge and then promote them and train them accordingly. Now, what this would mean is, in practice, that, let's say, the health secretary would be essentially a medical doctor with advanced degrees in medical management. The education secretary would be an educationist with relevant qualifications and experience in managing education. The people in charge of your various infrastructure development organizations would then be engineers that had management training and experience, and so on and so forth. Now, this effectively cut at the heart of the monopoly, or the near monopoly, the civil service of Pakistan, now known as the Pakistan Administrative Service, enjoyed. So when Cornelius was making these recommendations, 90% of Ayub Khan's federal secretaries were CSPs. And they, of course, ganged up on this proposal, and they convinced Ayub not to implement it. Then, when Bhutto comes to power, and there is another wave of civil service reforms, again, nobody pays any attention to what Justice Cornelius had said. Instead, what Bhutto wants is to have a civil service structure that does not have any statutory safeguards, that is essentially a prime ministerial civil service that answers directly to the top boss, and where people can be promoted and even recruited, reference the lateral entry scheme, on the basis of political loyalty. So he wants a politically committed civil service structure. And that, of course, means that the professionalism of people, their security from political interference, all of that is not necessary if you want to have a politically loyal civil service. So what we effectively do is that first, under Ayub, we miss a huge opportunity for setting our bureaucratic institutions on the path of becoming modern bureaucratic institutions based upon specialized knowledge. And then under Bhutto, what we do is that rather than trying to improve things, the government of the day consciously breaks the back of the civil service structure in order to render it the instrument in the hands of whoever happens to be politically powerful at any given point in time. So rather than moving forward, we first fail to move forward And then we essentially convert our bureaucracy into a kind of neo-medieval bureaucracy where personal loyalty and a sort of arbitrary internal management prevail. So we end up with, in a way, the worst possible bureaucratic structure any state that would want to modernize can end up with. You have a bureaucratic structure where not only are people not posted or transferred on the basis of merit, they are not recruited on the basis of their specialized knowledge. It is essentially an accident of the examination result that lands you in one service or the other. And there is no attempt to actually manage the services in a professional or a sound manner. So you don't even acquire the skills you need as you progress in the service, even if the initial recruitment is not necessarily based on subject knowledge. So that is what we end up with. Now, this kind of a state machinery obviously cannot develop the country. It can't even develop itself. So how is it going to develop the rest of the country?
Exactly, sir. Thank you so much, Dr. Ilhan Niaz. I really appreciate you coming on for this short interview. Thank you very much, sir.
Hey, my pleasure.